What do you appreciate about engaging with the Muslim community? What is an example of a bad argument that Muslims use against Christians? Welcome to our channel, where we make it our ambition to respect and learn from our neighbors, to equip the church, and share the message of Jesus until all hear. So we are here this weekend at a Christian conference where Christians are coming together to learn how to engage the Muslim community. So they're learning about Islam and they're learning strategies on how to engage with them and evangelize. And so we thought this would be a great opportunity to be able to ask them to give their feedback on their experience engaging with Muslims. Our goal here is always to set the table for Christians and Muslims and people from many different faiths to come together to have the real conversations. So we want to get some examples of them, of bad arguments that Muslims use, because we have other videos on our channel where we ask Muslims what are bad arguments that Christians use. So we don't want to have a double standard. So we want to hear that feedback from them, and we also want to hear what they appreciate about engaging with the Muslim community, because there is a ton of positives that come out of these conversations. So let's see what they have to say. All right, I'm here with my friend Ricky, and I have a couple questions for you. What do you appreciate about Muslims from your experience engaging with them?
It's pretty easy to have a conversation with them. They're open to talk. Generally, they're quite friendly and, very easy to talk to. It's very easy to initiate a conversation, and you're going to have a good conversation with them.
I agree. They're very willing to talk and come to the table and open the books and compare. So I'd agree with you on that. So I'm here with Paulo, and we're going to ask some questions in regards to his experience in engaging with Muslims in evangelism and dialogues. So my first question to you, Paulo, is what is it that you appreciate about conversations with Muslims?
Well, definitely specifically I'm talking about dawah. So I'm talking about those people if you happen to be from the GTA, in the Toronto area, you're probably very familiar with Yonge and Dundas Square. They're changing the name, but point is you know that area. And every single time I have gone, there is a Christian preacher, and then there's also Muslims that are giving out free Qurans and free Islamic material. And specifically those people that engage in dawah, which is basically just Muslim evangelization, a lot of them come from Christian backgrounds. And so what I appreciate is that a lot of them are actually not ignorant about the Bible, which is unfortunately something I cannot say for most Christians. Most Christians have never read the Quran in their life, and they have assumptions about what it says. But these Muslims that they've dedicated themselves to spread the message of Islam, I really appreciate that a lot of them have done their homework and done their research in order for the purpose of reaching out to Christians.
Right, that's a great answer. All right, I'm here with my co-host, Greg. And so, Greg, I want you to tell us, what do you appreciate about engaging with Muslims?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of things that I could say. Actually, to be honest, and this might sound strange for my Christian friends that might watch it, but I do actually I'm in many ways admire my Muslim friends and Muslim community, and often am inspired by them, especially those that are more devout and practicing. Praying 5 times a day, keeping that regular rhythm, focused on God, often learning so much about their own religion and sources, and memorizing the Quran, many verses often, some of them even the whole thing. Hafiz would, memorize the whole thing. And I don't see many parallels of that in the Christian community. And so in many ways I am inspired by just their example, and I think they strive to live a good, a moral, godly life. And so I appreciate having that as an example from friends that I know. And so talking with them, in that way, there's a commonality of spirit with valuing the truth, valuing, living not for yourself, but for God. And being willing even to submit. I mean, the whole idea of the core concept of Islam is submission. which is not a negative thing. It's a good thing to submit to God. I mean, right? So obviously we differ on which scriptures are right and ultimately how we are reconciled to God. But I can still appreciate so much about the Muslim community and how they practice things and their devotion and discipline. Talking with them also in terms of valuing truth. I'm not talking to a relativist or a leftist or progressivist who thinks all truth is relative or morality is relative. They don't believe that, so I don't even have to go there. We also believe in the existence of monotheistic God. So so many foundational things that we can start from. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. All right, I'm here with Camilo, and I have a couple questions for you. The first question is, what do you appreciate about engaging with the Muslim community?
They're really good listeners, so they're really open to talk about religion, and they show interest in hearing more about what Christians believe, and in detail. It's not just in general, it's like specifics about verses and specifics about particular doctrinal issues, questions about theology. So I would say that they're interested and they don't shy away from discussions that involve religion.
Now, what is an example of a bad argument that Muslims use against Christians that you think should be abandoned, it's not worth using because it would actually prevent Christians and Muslims from coming to the table together?
So I think it's a general principle that unfortunately Christians use against Muslims as well, and it's cherry picking verses out of context and then claiming that there's a contradiction and then just like going with that. It's just like like your book is false, and so Dawa Muslims do this a lot. On the street, they'll be like, oh, it says that Judas hanged himself, and then it also says Judas fell headlong and his entrails spilled out, and it's like, oh, contradiction, your Bible is corrupted.
How did Judas die? Tell me, how did Judas die?
Judas, the one that betrayed Jesus?
Yes.
But guts burst out in the field of blood.
Excellent. Acts 1:18, okay. Now this man, so we're talking about Judas, purchased the field with the reward of iniquity, falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst and his bowels gushed out, okay. So he purchased the field with that money and he fell down and his guts came out. If we go to, in Matthew, okay, in Matthew 27, okay, verse 5, and he cast down the pieces of silver. So he didn't buy a field with the pieces of silver in this account in the temple, and departed, and he went and hanged himself. So either he purchased the field with that money and fell down and his intestines came out, or he threw down the pieces of silver and he hung himself. Now this is a contradiction within the Bible about the account of how Judas died.
And when you look at it in context, there are other valid explanations. For example, the hanging might not refer to our modern Western view of like a noose and rope and actually being hung that way. It could be more of an impalement on a sharp object that's designed for that. And so that's one example.
Yeah, it's a great example of how the two texts can be reconciled and how there is not an actual contradiction there. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you, Ricky.
Thanks, Daniel.
If you could share an example of an argument that you wish they would stop using against Christians.
Yeah, and there are a couple, but this is a very common one. And like I said, I'm not talking about just, your average lunch break conversation with your Muslim coworker. I'm talking about these people on the streets, kind of the Dawa people. A very, very common question that I myself have encountered and that I've also seen being used on YouTube by people, for example, in London, England, that also do dawah. They will have someone approach them that is a Christian, and they will bring them a question that is meant to be a trap, basically. This is the question, and I'm sure you've heard of this before. To the Christian, they will say, do you believe that Jesus is God, or that he was just someone sent by God? Have you ever heard that question presented to you by
I haven't engaged that question, no, but I've heard this asked before.
Yeah, so it's a very common question that they ask Christians because they have a response for both answers. Right. So if you say, oh, I believe that Jesus is God, They will point to verses in the Gospels. Like I said, these are people that have done their homework. And so they will point to scriptures where it says that, the Father has sent me.
So, you see here, this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God. Now, see the comma, right? And Jesus Christ, whom you sent. So Jesus is saying, the one that sent Jesus is the only true God. So Jesus is saying that the one God that sent him is the only true God, and Jesus was sent by God, not God. Very explicit.
Or that God has sent me, or that God sent Jesus. And so if you respond, oh, okay, well then I guess Jesus was someone sent by God, then they will say, my brother, then that means you're actually a Muslim, because we also believe that Jesus was someone who was sent by God, but not God himself. So again, this is meant to present what is called a false dichotomy.
Right.
So
It's couldn't it be a both and?
Yeah, that's the thing. So when the average non-prepared Christian hears that, they feel like it's an either or. It's like either Jesus was God or he was only someone sent by God. There's no way he could be both.
Right.
The correct response for the learned Christian would be that Jesus is God the Son, who was sent by God the Father. So within Trinitarian theology, there is no contradiction and there is no false dichotomy. So that is a major one. And I'm presenting that because that is one that they often open with. And that is what often, and I've seen videos where the Christian says, oh, then I guess Jesus was sent by God. And the Muslim says, well, brother, you're actually a Muslim. And then they end up saying Shahada. And so that is one that we should definitely avoid.
But now I want to ask you, what's an example of a bad argument that you've experienced Muslims use that you think that they should get rid of because it doesn't help the conversations and it eventually would just put a bigger barrier between us? I'd like to hear an example from you.
I think the general principle is cherry picking verses from the Bible, because at face value it seems that they are saying something that would be maybe just contradictory to what Christians say they believe.
Right.
But cherry picking out of context, sometimes not even really reading what goes before, what really goes after. So not really, I would say not with a bad intention necessarily. It's just it lacks that context that will give the proper meaning to the verse. So in particular,
Yeah. Do you have a specific example?
in particular within cherry picking, I can think of Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve have sinned and they feel shame and they cover themselves, they are hiding from God. God is walking in the garden,
Right.
and then he asks Adam, where are you?
Right.
So at face value, you read that verse, God is walking. Is he a person?
Yeah. Do you worship a human? Is your God a human? Your God isn't all-knowing, all-powerful.
Right. And then why is he asking Adam where he is? He's God. He's supposed to know, right? But then of course you read the passage and you understand he's asking more of a rhetorical question, just like when a parent sees a little kid with chocolate all over their face, they will ask the kid, did you eat the chocolate that was in the drawer? They know what the kid did, but they're asking as precisely for the benefit of the kid. It's a chance to confess and so forth. There's meaning behind it. So yeah, that's what I can think of.
That's excellent. Thank you, Camilo. We're asking Christians today, what is an example of a bad argument that Muslims tend to use against Christians that you think should be abandoned so we can get to more important conversations around real issues?
Yeah, okay, so obviously I think there are many bad arguments from their side. I think there's, if you watch this channel and see, we're going to be critiquing Christian arguments too, and I first and foremost think, I actually think more about bad Christian arguments. But one that comes to mind that maybe is not often as talked about, but has come up in conversations I've had with Muslims, is the claim that in Genesis it uses the title Pharaoh for the king of Egypt. and at the end of Genesis 37 and various places in Genesis, when we know historically the title of Pharaoh was later than that time period, right? So it would match in the time period of Moses, Musa, but not in the time of Yusuf, Joseph, and Abraham, and so on. But we do see it used in Genesis, which is talking about events before the time of Moses. Although Moses is writing it, it is the Torah is with Moses. We both agree on that. So often it's brought up. Well, there's mistakes here historically about that. Like it's using the title before that title was used.
There is an evidence, for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran about the time of Moses and the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, yeah? And Allah talks at the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, He calls the ruler a king.
وقال الملك إن
At the time of Moses, He calls him a pharaoh.
وقال موسى يا فرعون.
But in the Bible, they call the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, and they call him a pharaoh.
Then Pharaoh sent.
And at the time of Moses, they call him a pharaoh.
When Pharaoh heard of this,
This is historical error. Because when they deciphered the Rosetta Stone, it's a thing, to understand the Egyptian hieroglyphics, they found out that there was no pharaohs at the time of Joseph. This dynasty didn't exist. There was kings. How did the Quran know this? And they say the Quran copies the Bible. The Quran copied from the Bible. Why didn't the Quran copy the mistake?
Well, I would say, first off, I think that's uncharitable reading it. While at first glance I could see why they would think that that's a mistake, we have to keep in mind the context for Moses. Moses is the one writing it. When was Moses? Okay, so he's in a time when there are pharaohs, right? And he's writing, who are the original audience of the Torah, the Pentateuch, is the generation that left Egypt, right? Was saved from under tyranny, under Pharaoh. So, and actually the Pharaoh is never named in Exodus, just to begin with, in the time of Moses. So seems to be, and scholars recognize this, there seems to be this motif or intention to not name him. And so I think I would see it as Moses is intentionally not naming him. He's trying to highlight the role. And it helps the reader at that time understand to connect it with Egypt, right? Now, what is interesting is actually it uses both. Muslims say, well, the Quran doesn't use the title Pharaoh. It calls in the time of Yusuf, but it does in the time of Moses, and it calls him King of Egypt in Yusuf, in Surah 12 in the Quran. But it does do that in Genesis as well. Genesis calls him the King of Egypt, but it also calls him the Pharaoh. So I think the point is it's trying to connect who the King of Egypt is with that, right? So that idea that this is often an unjust ruler is kind of connotation to it. Well, there's a double standard here too, okay? Because I can point the finger back at the Quran, okay? And I actually don't do this, but when Muslims do it, I will do it back, right? So in Surah Yusuf, I don't remember the verse, I think it's verse 20, ayah 20. It's when Yusuf is sold by, in this case, the caravan traders in Egypt. And it says he's sold for a few dirhams. Now, Genesis gets the right quantity of silver that we know historically from the time period of Joseph, how much a servant or slave was sold for. It's exactly right. We know it. The Quran gets it wrong because it's the wrong currency. It's not dirhams, it's shekels of silver, right? And it's a few, not, I think it's 20. So I guess the Quran is mistaken, right? It got a historical error. It's an anachronism. It's from the wrong time. So it's actually the same issue as with the Pharaoh, right? So it's a double standard to say that's not a mistake and try to defend that and say, well, and actually I would say, you know what? A Muslim can legitimately defend that because if you think about it, well, the Quran is not revealed in whatever century, 18th, 19th century BC of Joseph. It's revealed or written in the 7th century AD. Well, the currency at the time is a Byzantine currency, right? The dirhams. it's communicating at a time when in the contemporary audience they can understand. You could kind of say it's like a conversion. So maybe it's equivalent in the conversion rate to that different currency, and then it's not false necessarily. And I'm not going to use that as a sticking point. So if they're going to try to use it as a sticking point, I say, okay, right back at you. But I would say in both cases, legitimately, we can explain it.
Please share this video if you found this helpful, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you want to see more like it. Until next time, keep learning, keep loving, and keep sharing until all here.